You hear a lot of talk these days about how the internet's putting people out of work. They say Amazon's killing retail, brick and mortar stores. People just don't go down to the store to buy stuff anymore because they're buying it all online. This is the same old story that we heard a generation ago when they were saying the same thing about the Walmarts coming along and putting the mom and pop stores, mom and pop shops out of businesses on Main Street. It's cyclical. There's a lot of folks watching these videos who can remember a time back before the mom and pop shops, going back to the old country stores. Well, here's something very ironic. If we go back to some of those original old country stores, what we find is that somehow they're still here. They survived. They never really were in direct competition with the mom and pop shops on Main Street in the towns, because they were out in the country, and a lot of folks just didn't want to take the trip into the towns to save a few bucks on their merchandise items, so they stuck with the country stores. And then the same thing happened when the Walmart started going up alongside the interstates. These folks were so far out in the country, it didn't make a lot of sense to go into Walmart to save maybe $1.50 on a gallon of milk, because they would spend way more money on gas to go in there to save that $1.50 than it was worth. They'd be losing money. So the point of this is, the long and short of it, is that there's a lot of old country stores out there in the country that have survived even the .com craze, because for the longest time, the .com delivery services, even if it was the local post office, wouldn't deliver to some of these locations because they were so far out. Now they do now, okay? They do now, but the trends have been set. There are, especially if you're in an old area like here in Virginia, there are some old country stores that predate the Civil War. I'm going to tell you an amazing story about one such store. First, I'm going to tell you which store it's not, because a lot of folks who watch the videos have a general idea of where I live. You know, don't try to hide it. Outside of Charlottesville in Albemarle County. Would you believe the longest continuous single family owned country store in America is actually in Albemarle County? It's a place called Wyatt Store in Whitehall, outside of Charlottesville. The Wyatt family has owned that store continuously since, I believe, the 1880s. And about 5 years ago, the family that was in the #1 spot sold their business finally to somebody else, knocking them out, of course, of that position and moving Wyatt's into the #1 spot. If you're ever out that way, stop in and say hi. We made a video about that store once, one of our joy rides we were taking during the fall, seeing the leaves. We stopped and told that story there. But I wanted to tell it again so that you won't think this story pertains to that store, because it doesn't. And the reason I'm telling you this is because Wyatt's store at the turn of the last century had a fire and part of it burned down. The store in today's story did as well, but it actually had 2 fires and burned down. This store is in a neighboring county. It's not in Albemarle County. It's somewhere between here and DC. Okay, we're not too far from DC. And even though DC is a sprawling city, for those of you who have been there, you know this, or if you've seen it on television, it's amazing how you can drive less than an hour outside of that city and be virtually in the middle of nowhere in so many parts of the state, okay? That's where this store is, but I'm not going to tell you specifically which part. It's a store I've been to several times. It's a store that I've gone to on occasion for more than 20 years now. And it's a store I visited recently where I was told one heck of an amazing story that I'm going to share with you here today. Okay, what brought up the conversation in the first place was that this old country store that survived the Walmarts, was never in competition with the mom and pop shops on Main Street, down there, or maybe on the DuPont Circle there in DC a century ago, still here despite Amazon, because they're in such a rural area. They don't serve a lot of customers, but the ones they do serve are loyal to them. I mean, their loyalty with this business goes back multiple generations. So I was in this store recently. We were up in that part of the world for some reason, and I stopped in because it'd been a while. In the center of the store, there's actually an old wood stove. It's beautiful. And there's some chairs that sit around the wood stove. And I was talking to the gentleman who was in the store that day, and you know, maybe I've seen him there before, maybe I haven't. It wasn't ringing a bell, but he was old, and as it turned out, he has worked in that store for more than 30 years, though he's not part of the family that owns it. He's a family friend, and he's worked there for 30 years. So I asked him, I said, so in the winter when it's cold, to like your friends, your buddies come in and sit around the wood stove and keep warm and tell stories like back in the old days, you know, if you think circa Andy Griffith's show. He said, well, they come in, they sit around and drink soda pops, but we don't burn in the stove. He said it's actually against the law to do that. It's kind of there as a symbol of days gone by, because once upon a time we used to burn in that stove to keep the place warm, but it's actually illegal now. It's against fire codes, I guess. It's caused too many fires. And I said, did a fire take place in this store because of the wood stove? And he said, actually, he said there have been 2 fires in this store. One was attributed to that wood stove, but it had nothing to do with the wood stove. It was about 30 years ago. Yeah, 20, 25, late 90s. But we'd already stopped burning in the wood stove by then. But officially, the official story was attributed to the wood stove causing the fire, and it took the lives of 3 people when it happened. And I said, okay, now you're going to tell me that, and then you're not going to give me details. I've got to have the details. You've left me hanging. What's the story behind the story? And he laughed and he said, how much time you got? And I said, when it comes to a good story, I got all the time in the world, my friend. So he gave me a considerable amount of history to the store. It, like the one here in the county I mentioned, goes back before the Civil War. Though it hadn't always been held by the same family, it would change ownership off and on throughout the years. But he said, he said, you know, that looks like what used to be a vacant lot back behind the store? And I said, yeah. And he said, that vacant lot, which is where the dumpster is, and it looks like that's where they're piling up their pallets and a bunch of crap that really is a little bit cluttered. They could probably use some cleaning back there. He said that actually used to be part of the store. It was like a back room that was attached to the store. And he said that was kind of like a community area, even though it was never official. He said, but back in the days of Prohibition, now this would be Great Depression era, back when alcohol and marijuana were both deemed illegal for a number of years. You couldn't get a drink, despite how badly a lot of folks wanted one. It was terrible times going through the Great Depression. They were losing everything they had. It was tragic. Well, this thing came about called speakeasies. Now, most of you watching this video knows what speakeasies are because you're up on your history and you're up there in your years. No offense. I've checked the demographics of the channel, and I know that 70% of you are actually my age or older. For any Generation Zers here who aren't familiar with speakeasies, what speakeasies were is they were secret bars during days of Prohibition. It was illegal to drink. It was illegal to buy and sell alcohol. It was illegal to congregate together and partay. So people would use their basements in their houses. Or in this case, in this story, there was this whole back community section of this old country store where around about midnight, in the summer, a little bit earlier, once the sun went down, people would secret to this location to party. And now, of course, it was never advertised other than by word of mouth, and you had to whisper. You had to speak easy about these party spots so no one would overhear. You didn't want the po-po coming in, right? And ending the party. So there was a speakeasy back here in the back of this store, and this is south of DC, okay? I'll give you that. It's south of DC. Now, at the time, the gentleman explained to me, there were 2, for lack of a better term, we'll call them gangs. There were 2 gangs of bootleggers that were running booze throughout the general area there. We call it tri-state, even though one's a district of Columbia, but Virginia, Maryland, and DC. Okay, running booze in and out, back and forth, making all that dirty money under the table in the black market of alcohol. And they would often stop at this speakeasy, members from both gangs, okay? Each member of both gangs knew who the other people were, and they just kept their distance, all right? They'd go in, they'd wet their whistle. They wouldn't speak, but they gave each other enough respect not to start any problems, okay? Until, you guessed it, a woman got involved, right? Now, it's not her fault, okay? I'm not blaming her. I'm not saying, she bit that apple and said, here, Adam, try this, and then became, whatever. One of the guys had a girlfriend, and I guess she was a looker. And one night, him and a couple of his cronies were in this speakeasy at the back of this old country store, and they were wetting their whistles, having some drinks. And the other group comes in, and the guy's got his beautiful girl on his arm, and the other guys have been in there for a while. Their whistles were quite wet, and they were already, as they'd say up in New England, well into their cups. If you're not from New England, that would mean they were pretty drunk. And one of the guys from the other gang started looking a little too long, and the girl started looking back a little too long. Fast forward, you know what happened? It was a brawl. It was just this gang A against gang B, fighting it out in the speakeasy. And they really kept everything on the low key, okay? They would turn off the electricity. And a lot of them just blared music, and they had bands. But this place, they'd turn off the electricity. They lit the place by kerosene lanterns in there, okay? Well, kerosene lanterns got knocked all over the place. A fire broke out. The place went up in flames. Everybody ran out of the place. Everybody that was there partying got out except for these 6 guys. 3 from gang A, 3 from gang B. And the story's been passed down that the onlookers were outside, safe from the fire, looking in, and they just saw fists a-flying and feet a-kicking, and these guys were in there fighting to the death until death by way of fire. So that was during the Great Depression, days of Prohibition, right? That's fire number 1. Well, they never rebuilt that back part of the old country store. That it became a lot, and they left it at that. And then shortly thereafter, Prohibition would end. And though marijuana wasn't legalized yet, though it has been in many states just recently here in Virginia, alcohol was. So people could buy alcohol, they could sell it with a license, and people could drink as long as they were 18 until, I think it was the late 70s, they raised the age to 21. And here we are today, okay? So I asked the guy, tell me about fire number 2. And he says, well, I'm getting to that. He says, I was here for fire number 2. It was in the 90s. Okay, he said it was in the winter. It was cold, but again, there was no fire in the wood stove because it had already been outlawed to have fires in wood stoves in old country stores by then. He was closing up for the night. It was on a weekend. He had already turned off all the lights. He'd already done everything, counted the money, put it in the bank bags or whatever. The safety lights were on around the sides of the building, just inside the windows. That was it. He was grabbing his personal effects, his car keys, his coat or whatever. And just as he's standing up, 3 guys come into the store, okay, walking in. Lights off. He didn't get a very clear image, a very clear depiction of these guys. If he were to be able to try to describe them as far as facial features or whatnot, he said he wouldn't be able to because it was simply too dark. He said what he noticed is that as he was saying, he says, sorry guys, we're closed. He thought they'd come into the store perhaps to purchase belts like this, just common belts, because he said their pants were sagging so low. I can't even do it. You wouldn't want me to anyway. Their pants were sagging down so low behind their butts, and it looked like they were holding them up. They literally, he said they had to hold their pants up in the front with one hand. So he assumed at first they were coming in to buy a belt because their pants were falling off. But when he realized what was in their other hand, what they were doing with their other hand, they were holding handguns. He knew that they did not come in to buy anything. They came in to take. They walked right up to the counter holding their saggy pants up with one hand and holding their handguns in the other hand, and they said, give us some money. He said that's all they said. And the guy has his hands up, and he said that he knew day one going to work in this store, if this thing ever happened, he would gladly give away all the money because it wasn't worth his life. And so he said that was his intentions. He said, okay, let me put this, he's trying to make sure they didn't like panic. He said they were teens. Now, not that they were 13 or 14. He said they were certainly old enough to be legal adults, 18, 19, okay, late teens of legal age, but they weren't in their 20s. He said they were young. He could tell that. He could hear it in their voice, even though it was dark. You know, even men still kind of have a little bit of baby in their voice until they get past 30. So he was thinking 18, 19 years old. He starts to explain, just, now come on boys, just be patient with me. Let me put this stuff down. I'll give you the money. And they became irate. The ringleader said, boy, I ain't no boy. I'm a gangster. Now give me the effing money. And he said, just at that time, he heard a voice from the back side of the building that said, gangster, you ain't no gangster. You're a bitch. Pull your effing pants up and go back home to your mama. And the three guys that were holding him up and him looked back towards the back of the building, and it was back where that speakeasy part used to be. And right there where the door used to be, there were 6 men, 6 dark figures standing there in the dark. There were no safety lights in this part of the store, and barely any light was being cast to this part of the store from the safety lights on the other part of the store. But he could tell these 6 men had on what appeared to be zoot suits, okay, Depression era suits, and top hats. And they were down like this. They looked like this. And in the midst of them, he could see the figure, the hourglass figure of a beautiful woman. Well, he said the 3 guys that were holding him up went straight towards these 6 guys and the girl, started talking a bunch of crap, cussing and cursing and telling them what they were going to do. Said the minute they got back there where these 6 guys were, these 6 guys reached their arms around them. And as they were doing this, those 3 guys started unloading their handguns into these dark figures. But the dark figures continued to get their arms around them, and then they started to glow brilliantly until they lit up in flames. And the men that they had held started screaming and trying to get away, but those mysterious figures that were dark but were now inflamed held them so tight they couldn't get away. The man working the store that night got his stuff, he ran outside, and it was shortly thereafter, sirens started going off, lights started going off, the back part of the store was on fire, police come, fire engines come. Now the guy tells me, okay, small community, everybody knows everybody else. They're not too fond of being less than an hour outside of the city and having to deal with some of that, some of the shenanigans that happens in the cities that typically don't happen in small country communities like this, such as being held up at gunpoint. So he told the story as he recalled it to the police officer. And this was, again, late 90s. Police officer looks at him and he says, well, it sounds to me like I'm going to have to cite you for burning in that wood stove. You know that's a federal offense. You're no longer allowed to burn in wood stoves inside these old country stores. And that wood stove is the cause of this fire. And it's so unfortunate that 3 people perished in this fire. He says if their families ever come forward and try to sue you for it, that's going to be a whole nother issue you're going to have on your hands. But between now and then, you're going to have to tell, you know, the folks that own this place, they're going to have to pay a fine. Handed him the ticket. No further questions were ever asked. And that's a story that's been handed down for the past generation at least. Hope you enjoyed this story from here at Homesteading Off the Grid. If you did, make sure to come back for more next time.